Hello, wonderful. It is Sarah K. Ramsey, and I'm here with Lundy Bancroft, who is going to answer the question, why does he do that? How are you, Lundy?
I'm doing very fine, sir. How about you?
Oh, good. I'm just such a fan of his work. I told him that the first book that I read of his, I had checked out from the library. And as I opened it, instead of waiting for Amazon to bring me a new one, I just started writing in the library book and ended up buying it because I was just so intrigued to underline and highlight and put my notes in. And it's just been such a gift. So you've written that book. Joyous Recovery is your latest book. Is that right?
Yes.
Which definitely aligns with strength-based healing that we've talked about. And we'll get more into that, as well as When Dad Hurts Mom. Any other books that you want to point out that might be?
I wrote a book that's a few years ago. That's a set of short daily readings. They call it Daily Wisdom for Why Does He Do That, which is kind of an unfortunate title. That wasn't my idea. That's what's just hard to remember. And daily, it also is the kind of title that makes you say, like, what did you just say? But anyhow, Daily Wisdom for Why Does He Do That. That's a book that I put a lot into. I care quite a bit about that book because to write 365 pieces, because there's one for every day of the year, that's an opportunity to really explore a lot of different issues in the lives of abused women. And I end each of those pieces with a proposed focus for the day, like just a kind of line. It's almost like a mantra, you might call it, but like a line to give yourself to kind of work from for the day. So that's another one I would love people to know about. Yeah.
Well, and I want to point out, should I stay or should I go? Right? Because that's such a distinct question for so many women. So you co-authored that one, right?
Right, with Jack Patrici. And the other thing that book does that the other books don't do is go into some issues beyond just issues of having an abusive partner. They also go into issues of having an alcoholic or drug addicted partner, or into having a partner with really serious mental health problems. So sometimes that helps answer some questions about, well, what is the essential problem going on with him? Like, what is he really suffering from?
No, I love that. So definitely one of the main questions that my ladies have for you is, how many success stories have you seen? If they get them to the right person, or they get them to, I send people this morning to your checklist of, is he really willing to change? Is the abuser really willing to change on your website? And, what are the chances really?
It's one thing I always like to make sure that people understand is it's not like surgery somehow that like might succeed or might fail or has a certain success rate, because it entirely has to do with whether he does the work or not. So it's as if you were going into a surgery that was totally going to succeed or fail depending on how hard you tried, not how hard the surgeon tried, how hard you tried the surgery. And so the great majority of abusers are actually capable of doing the work. The only ones who like literally couldn't do the work are ones who are severely drug and alcohol involved, or who are severely personality disordered. The rest could do the work. So the issue isn't that the program doesn't work, or that they're in the wrong service, or that somehow the counselor isn't doing it right. The issue is they're not willing to do the work. The work involves looking really hard at themselves. First of all, the first thing they have to do is admit to everything they've done and all the ways that they've mistreated their partner, and really they have to take a full inventory of all the ways that they've mistreated past partners. Unfortunately, most abusers fail at step one. They're not willing to do any real serious admitting. They're particularly not willing to admit to her, yeah, you know what, you were right all along, I was doing those things. As a lot of your audience, as a lot of your audience will know, the abuser a lot of times lies to her about what she just saw him do. Like she'll say, you just called me such and such a name, and he'll say, no, I didn't.
And can you tell the story? It was in one of your books about you were running a group for men, and then they was like recorded. I'm pretty sure this was in your book. And then you left, and they caught the recording, and they were giving each other tips and tricks to.
Oh, no, they were doing that right in front of us. What it was that the two counselors were preparing a skit to give at a conference. to illustrate, what goes on between an abuser and the abused woman. And they decided to rehearse it before the conference for the abuser group. And the abusers immediately started to give David, who was playing the abuser, all these tips. And it was one of the things that really showed that they have much more awareness than they admit to having about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And then to really make changes, they have to totally give up blaming the woman, like, you made me do it, or, oh yeah, I'll change this, but only if you change this. Like, all that bargaining stuff has to stop. And they have to be willing to work on themselves for years, literally years. Like, they're not going to go to 16 weeks or something. Like, I've heard of these absurdly short programs. It takes them years, and I would say 2 to 3 years minimum of really hard, committed work. Well, part of what abuse is all about is about how selfish the abuser is. Now, he's not necessarily selfish in town. A lot of times he's Mr. Generous out in town, but in his relationships, he's so selfish. So how are you going to get a guy who's got such a selfish orientation towards relationships to devote like 3 years of his life to working really hard on himself and making her needs the priority, making it the priority to learn how to treat her properly? So I hate to say it, but the reality is very few guys, even though the great majority could do the work, a very small percentage actually are willing to do the work. And the good news for women is it's actually pretty easy to tell whether he's really doing the work or not if someone tells you what to look for. Like you were saying, like, you give your audience some pointers about what things to look for, and that's exactly right, because otherwise you're looking for the wrong things. If you know the right things to look for, you'll be able to tell whether he's serious about doing it.
And things to look for, as in not always having to get their way, it not always being their turn, not setting all the rules of the relationship and breaking all the rules of the relationship, right? Is that?
Yes, and things like not just changing how he deals with not getting his way, but changing how he deals with her being angry. Like, has he actually started to accept her right to be angry with him?
And there's a line in your book, and it said, he doesn't have a problem with anger. He has a problem with your anger. Right? And I'll never forget reading that. Yeah.
Right, because he really doesn't believe a partner has a right to call him out on stuff. Mm-hmm. And he thinks he's like above being called out on stuff. And so that's one of the ways you can tell if he's serious about changing is he actually starting to accept being seriously confronted, being seriously confronted about stuff. Mm-hmm. And one other thing I think that's important for women to understand is the work that he has to do is so hard over such a long period of time that if he can't even start it, he's never going to finish it. And I say this because a lot of women think, well, I'll just pay for his first couple sessions, or I'll drive him, because if he just gets in the door. And I understand why. I mean, I understand she wants that hope. I totally understand she wants that hope. It's just unfortunately not a realistic hope. It's like, oh, if I can just get him in the door, he'll start to see that it's not so bad. That's not how abusers work. Abusers don't want to do the hard work. They get pissed off when people challenge them about what they've been doing. And if he can't even get himself in the door, he's never going to do 2-3 years of work that he has to do. So don't hand him a check for the first session. Don't drive him. Don't say, well, I'll make the phone call to make the appointment. Because if he can't do those things, he's never going to do the rest.
And, these men just are not good at loving others, right? Is that fair?
No, that actually really varies. They're not good at loving others in the context of an intimate partner relationship. But some of these men are very loving towards their parents, towards their siblings, towards their best friends. But in the context of an intimate partner relationship, he can't be fair. He's unwilling to be fair. He can't do give and take. Everything has to be about what you're doing for him. Again, early in the relationship, he's Mr. Generous. Oh, we're going to make beautiful music together. But as soon as the relationship's gotten solid and serious, it's all about what you got to do for me, what you got to do for me.
And do you see that as a pattern? Because the reason I asked that question is, oh gosh, he's treating her so well, right? Like, I put in all these years and now look, he's treating her so well. And I want to really break through that lie.
So two things about that. First of all, it's probably not true, but if it is true, it won't last. he can be very good for a while to a new partner while he's on a campaign against his old partner.
Mhm.
In other words, when that's actually part of his abuse, when mistreating her is actually, when being good to her is actually part of how he abuses his ex-partner. And, that's so painful when you've been left by an abuser and then you see him like parading around this other girl, and she's often like younger, and he'll try to find someone who's extra pretty or whatever. That relationship doesn't last,
Mhm.
but it sure hurts while it's, it sure hurts to watch while it's happening.
Well,
No, he can't be in a serious relationship without abusing. He can't be in a relationship that lasts any length of time without.
mhm. And what about as a parent, right? These men, whether they be address violence, obviously, but then just manipulation. Can you speak of that?
Well, yeah. First of all, if you're abusing children's mother, you're a rotten parent because there's hardly anything worse you can do to your kids than to abuse their mother. So when I have guys say, "Oh yeah, I've done some bad things to her, but I'm a really good father," I say, "No, you're not. That's terrible fathering in itself. Like that's hurting your kids a lot." Now, that doesn't mean that every guy who abuses women abuses children. It just means that every guy who abuses women is doing children a lot of harm and is being incredibly selfish and irresponsible about how his behavior is affecting them. There are just so many different parenting styles among abusers that it's hard to cover all the different ones. But some of the key things are where he's terrible to them too. Another style is where he's quite good to them, especially when he wants to turn them against her. In other words, when it's kind of part of his power trip. Another style is to be, more or less okay with them, except refuse to look at how badly he's hurting them through what he's doing to their mom. And then another style that I think is important for people to be aware of is the style that really wants to mess up those kids' relationship with their mother, and often really wants to mess up those kids' relationship with each other. The real splitter style of abuser. He sows divisions. If there's a custody battle, he's going to do everything to try to destroy those kids' relationship with their mom so that they'll ask to live with him. So that's an especially toxic.
Well, yeah. And what advice would you give to moms? I know that's a huge problem, and I'm asking you for a quick answer, but where would you tell them to start?
Well, interestingly, what I would most tell her to start is to expand her own support system.
Mm-hmm.
And people are sometimes surprised. Like, that's what you say she needs to be doing about her parenting? Yeah, the main thing is you need a lot more people behind you. Better friendships, repair your relationships with your relatives if you can, be in a support group for abused women or a betrayal support group or whatever kind of support group is right for you. And because your children you're gonna have a harder parenting life than a mom who's got a responsible co-parent. Even compared to other divorced moms, you're going to have a hard time compared to a woman who divorced a guy who wasn't an abuser. In other words, someone who was willing to be some kind of responsible co-parent with her. And so then the next thing is to really have to think about how to keep your maternal authority, because the abuser tends to undercut your parental authority with your kids, and that's not easy. It's very hard to maintain your authority while the other person is undercutting it. There aren't easy answers.
Can I dive into that just 1 second?
Yeah.
And what he's saying for my listeners is, right, if your kids see him as the person of power and see you as the person of weakness, is a complete uphill battle. And and it's hard to stand up to him. It's hard to stay, especially if he's been awful. But if your kids see you as the dog that keeps getting kicked, with all the sympathy and love for that situation, they see you as a weak dog and him as their protector. And that is an incredibly dangerous situation. So as you think, oh, I don't want to set boundaries, I don't want to do the work of going toe to toe with him, you're not a bad mom for going toe to toe to him. You're showing your children your strength. Are you agreeing?
I think that's right. And you also have to forgive yourself. As long as you do your job as well as you can do it, you have to forgive yourself for what happens. Because, for example, some days going toe to toe with him just gets them hurt. No. It just makes things worse, depending on how he reacts or who he decides to punish that day. Like some abusive men are the style where the woman stands up to him, he doesn't punish her for standing up to him. He punishes the kids for the fact that she stood up to him. Then what's she going to do? You know, then she's really in a terrible bind. So it takes a lot of creativity. It takes talking to your kids practically every day of the week about the need to respect each other and respect themselves and respect you. And I think the courts don't agree with me about this, but I think it requires talking to the kids quite directly about the abuse they've witnessed. It doesn't mean saying bad things to them about their father, but it does mean saying some critical things to them about their father's behavior. In other words, don't say bad things about him.
Yeah, can you give some examples of that for my moms listening?
So in other words, you don't want to say he's a jerk or he's an abuser or your dad's selfish, but you want to say things like, you know, that wasn't acceptable. That wasn't appropriate what he did there. That hurt you. You know, that's not okay. A parent shouldn't do that. Or it wasn't acceptable the way he was talking to me. And you're talking to me in ways that you heard him talk to me, and it wasn't okay when he did it, and it wasn't okay when you do it. Those are the kinds of examples of having to go pretty directly at what the kids have witnessed and what the kind of model, the kind of very unhealthy model that their father has set for them.
One of the things I tell my women to do is, if their kids are talking to them in the way that their ex did, is use the phrase, I don't let people talk to me that way anymore. Because if the kids saw it and they thought that was normal, it kind of gives the kids a new signal. There's a new mom in town, right? It's like, I know I put up with that before, but that is not that's no longer who I am.
And on some level, kids like the idea that mom is growing.
Oh, absolutely.
And they also like by the way, they also really like the idea that mom's got more support in her life. So it's good to tell kids,
I agree with that.
I have more friends than I used to have, or I have more people there for me. Kids really like hearing that. But another thing, building on what you just said, which I thought was exactly right, I would then also add, and I don't want you to let anyone talk to you that way.
Yes.
Try to keep making the connections with kids. Like, the way you're treating me is how other people are going to treat you. And so how about you treat me well, and let's also insist that other people treat you well.
No, I love that. And I agree completely with the support system. And if there are any people in your life willing to say nice things about you in front of your children, that's a huge piece of this puzzle. Oh, your mom's a great mom, because, and give that gift to your other divorced mom friends, right? You know, such a gift to be around the table and say, you're so lucky to have your mom. Do you see the things she does for you and how kind she is? That's a huge piece of women supporting women in this process.
That's a really good point that I don't hear other people making. I really like that. And if you have male friends that can do that, that'll have a power of its own. And because the one thing that we really don't want is, we don't want kids in thinking that their dad defines what it means to be a man, because we don't want them to follow that image. And people think, oh, boys really need good male role models. Well, girls really need good male role models too, because the boys are deciding how to be a man. The girls are deciding what should they expect from men in their lives. And so it's equally important for the girls. And so it's really great if you have a brother who's a great guy, or just a friend who's a great guy, to have them around your kids, so kids see, like, this is manhood. Manhood isn't about being a jerk. And they also then see him treating you with respect, or him making the kind of comments you were just talking about, oh God, your mom is such a cool person, or she's really thinking about you.
And this is manhood. Manhood isn't being a jerk was not a conversation about a father, right? You did not say, this is manhood. See, he's not a jerk like your dad is, right? Like, that's the wrong way. It's almost like subliminal messaging, right? But in a way that it's just about parents teaching their children good skills. We get it in our head like, oh, that's like bad because it's about their dad. No, pointing out positive male role models has nothing to do with bashing their father. Those are two, you would do that in any circumstance, in a good teaching moment. That's
right. If kids ultimately make a connection to what you're saying to their dad, it's because there's a connection to their dad that they need to make. And it's like, they're not going to connect to their dad if their dad's not like that.
Exactly right. Okay, so a couple of people were asking questions about what changes you've seen in the last 5, 10, 15 years, whether they be court systems, the conversations around abuse. What have you seen?
Well, maybe I'll break them into categories of sort of where I really have hope, and what are the things where I'm most concerned, things that I think are going in the wrong way.
Yes.
So on the positive side, yeah, conversations are really changing. Like the American culture, and I don't know if your audience may be abroad as well, but I can really only speak to what's going on in the U.S. and to a lesser extent Canada. But American culture has come a long way. There's just much less acceptance of abuse than there was, say, 30 years ago. There's much more support for an abused woman. You're much more likely to hear you don't deserve to be treated that way instead of, well, you got to make the relationship work, which is the negative message. You're much more likely to be able to find information online, in a book, or other sources, a program to give you some help and support. There was at least a period of time when police were responding more sensitively nationally, and at least a period of time when judges were responding more sensitively nationally. Healthcare providers, you have a better chance now than some time back that a doctor maybe will know something about abusive relationships, and he or she might ask you a helpful question or give you a helpful pamphlet. So there's some things to be really hopeful about there. Finally, in our time, faith communities are starting to have this conversation, and that's really important because so many women are involved in their church or their synagogue or their mosque, wherever they may go. And if that's a place where you can actually talk about abuse and get supported about abuse, that's really, really helpful. Versus, again, negative messages you may get from some faith communities that your love will heal him, which it won't, unfortunately, or that she needs to work harder somehow at being better, and that's what's going to get him to stop being abusive, which it has never once worked in the history of the human race.
Has never once worked in the history. Like, I just want to, I agree completely. I want to say has never once worked. So if there's some cognitive dissonance going on in your head and you're thinking, oh, but I just need to be more loving, more giving, more forgiving, you cannot be so unselfish that you teach someone else to be unselfish. Maybe it's like when their kids growing up, maybe that we need boundaries with our kids too, right? But we've got to get that piece out of our head that we just need more loving. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I think it's really good. I'm glad you underlined that point. Partly because the abuser is constantly sending you the message that if you would just change what you do, then I would change what I do. And it absolutely never works. A woman cannot change her abusive partner's behavior by making any changes or improvements in what she does. The only things that will sometimes, not even very often, but sometimes will change his behavior is leaving him, no contact for substantial periods of time, like months at a time, or if he's committing a crime, like assaulting you physically, calling the police and having him arrested.
Yeah.
And again, even those steps will only help a small percentage of the time. You can't by being more loving. I talk about how people tell abused women that they should stand up to the guy more and that they should stand up to him less and that'll solve the problem. Well, how can opposite solutions solve the problem? And the truth is neither of them will work. And I like to point out to women, sometimes it's the same person in your life who's telling you should stand up to him more and you should stand up to him less. Because they're saying,
the analogy of the big bad wolf, right? Like, so you have the three little pigs and they had different levels of boundaries, but none of them changed the big bad wolf. He still wanted to gobble them up. Every time.
I like that. I like
right?
that.
Yeah. So where do you still see concerns? Where?
So there's a long way to go in faith communities, and that's an issue that a lot of people are really trying to work on now, is to get women better supported in their religious communities. So that's really important. The custody courts have become actually worse than they were when I came into the field. They've become a more unfriendly environment for abused women. This is what my latest book is about, which won't be out for many months still, maybe as much as a year. But my new book is about what's happening to abused women, specifically in the custody system. Except it's a novel. I'm in the midst of writing my first piece of fiction ever. Decided I'd try to bring you this information in a form that was a little more entertaining.
I think your books are very entertaining.
Thank you. This is also a book that'll be easier to hand to someone else. Like you just want to hand it to someone who's never had this experience and just say, oh, here's a fun mystery to read. And so that's huge cause for concern. There's police response is actually going backwards after a period of time when it was getting a lot better. And the child protection response is going backwards after a period of time when it was getting a lot better. So some of the gains we made have are starting to slip away in recent years. Unfortunately, the whole sort of world of domestic violence services has become such a huge system of powerful nonprofits that it has actually backed off from really raising hell about the kinds of issues that we have to raise hell about. So I encourage people to, in the years ahead, to kind of put on an activist hat, in a sense, more than a social worker hat, and think we've got to go back to really protesting, and this has to go back to being a women's rights struggle. There are people who say, oh, well, you know, domestic violence used to be thought of as a women's rights issue, but now we're realizing that it's an issue that affects men too, and we want to not sort of focus on it anymore as a women's rights issue. Well, yes, it affects men too, but when you stop focusing on it as a women's rights issue, what do you get? You get exactly what's happening in the last 5 to 10 years, which is what I've just been describing, all these areas in which we're starting to lose ground instead of gain ground. The precise reason why that's happening is because people have backed off from focusing on domestic violence as a women's rights issue. So we've got to go back to that.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I love that. And I started looking at women's issues in general and in my life, like all these wonderful women, like what is their fail? And it's toxic relationships, right? Over and over and over again. And really breaking through the cognitive dissonance and breaking through that belief that like, oh, she would never, if she's okay, strong and independent is not the same thing as good at, you know, making sure you don't get into toxic relationships, or what I call becoming toxic person proof, right? Lots of strong and independent women have ended up in toxic relationships, right?
One of the most known women in the world at the moment, J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter books, is now talking publicly about her history, having been abused and having faced sexual assault. And that's very courageous of her, and it's having an important impact. People think, yeah, you know, J.K., if it can happen to J.K. Rowling, it can happen to anyone.
And I love hearing women's stories, especially women who are victims who aren't victim-y, right? You know, they've come back into their power and speaking from a place of healing. So let's talk about the healing strategies, right? You know, I talk about strength-based healing, you know, which I think you would be aligned with, even though we haven't discussed that as much. But we talked about kind of some of the dangers. People think, oh, I can just find any therapist in my, you know, what we used to call the yellow pages, right? We don't call that anymore in the US, but, oh, I can just Google any therapist and they're going to be toxic relationship experts, abuse experts. They're going to understand all the tools I need. And that has not been your experience as well as mine.
People are surprised. People are surprised to hear that you can get a therapy license, whether as a psychologist or as a clinical social worker or as a marriage and family counselor, without having had a single class on any form of abuse. Those therapeutic fields are catching up so gradually. Some places you have the option of a class on abuse. Some places there's not even any such class, but it's not a requirement for your licensure or your degree. So yeah, you really do have to ask questions and do quite a bit of exploration to find out who's someone who will know what I'm up against and who will really know this particular territory. I really encourage women to go to support groups and that are through the domestic violence programs. And some women will say, well, he was never physically violent towards me. And a lot of places will completely welcome you into the support group, even if he was never physically violent towards you. And by the way, a lot of times when there was no physical violence, he was horrible to the woman sexually. And it's like, well, that's just as violent, even if it wasn't like a beating. It's
Right.
just as violent to your body as physical abuse is. But even if there was neither, even if it was just pure psychological cruelty, a lot of support groups will say, hey, if you've dealt with a really abusive man, you're welcome here.
Yeah.
And I emphasize group just because that's what I've most heard back from women about over my 30 years in the field. That's what women have most said to me. That's what made the difference in my life, was the group. But there are also a lot of different kinds of online groups. And of course, nowadays during the epidemic, nothing is happening in person. So look around for different kinds of possibilities to participate in Facebook groups or Zoom groups or different kinds of things that are online, either with video or just in writing. And there are some remarkable possibilities out there. And then what my book, The Joyous Recovery, is about preparing people to be part of an organization that I'm building called the Peak Living Network, a very loosely run, like open organization. That's where I'm really encouraging abused women to start their own support groups, because I don't believe the whole assumption that you have to find some super experienced, super credentialed person to do this. It's like, no, you can do it. Who do you think started the first support groups for abused women? Psychologists? No. Women who'd been physically battered women started all the early support groups for abused women.
And
it's like,
there's a phrase
obviously,
you said.
That's why we're here.
Well, yeah, exactly. Right. There was a phrase you said that was so important that I do want to point out, that so much of therapy is based on, kind of diagnosing what went wrong rather than creating a future that can go right. And that was kind of my words. Do you remember exactly what you said? But it was that diagnosing what kind of went wrong and rehashing.
Yeah, that I believe we need to get much more down to earth about where healing actually comes from, and start to have a much clearer plans. And so one of my fundamental messages in the Joyous Recovery is, first of all, it's very hard to go off and heal by yourself.
Yeah.
That's the problem with the whole notion of self-help, is that you're going off to help yourself. And actually, healing is much more effective when it's like you learn how to work in threes, and we need to learn how to work in groups. And that's what the Peak Living Network is all about, is training people to work in twos, threes, and groups, and to make healing a collective process. And there are other ways that the Joyous Recovery is different from other approaches to healing, including what you're talking about the emphasis on doing strength-based work. That's definitely one of the key concepts from the Joyous Recovery. Another key concept from the Joyous Recovery is that our own built into our bodies, like biological mechanisms for healing from emotional abuse, from emotional injury, have largely been suppressed. Like,
yawning.
Cramped down.
Well, yeah, one of those.
Isn't that interesting?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, one of those, because I was putting out some, I talk about lion's breath, in my stuff. And you even talked about yawning, right? Like getting some of that tapping into that biological piece of us to be healed, right? So tell me about yawning. That was such a fun thing.
Yawning is actually a mysterious one, because we don't really understand what role yawning plays in the world of emotional healing. But we know that it plays an important role. And how do we know that? We know that because when people are doing intense processing of emotions, they almost invariably start to yawn. Like if you watch someone, say a friend of yours or yourself, say someone's really upset and they're crying really hard for like 15 minutes, like I don't mean like weepy, like tears going down their cheeks type. I mean like busting a gut, like crying their eyes out type crying. Then they stop and suddenly they start to do all this yawning. Mm-hmm. Or you'll see the opposite sometimes. You'll see someone yawn and yawn and yawn and then break into tears. Mm-hmm. And so we get these clues that yawning is somehow woven into this process. One of the things that I explain in the Joyous Recovery is that we come into the world not just built to heal physically, which we know about, right? We know about our immune system in the physical sense, but that we actually come into the world built to heal emotionally. Mm-hmm. And that is particularly through laughter, crying, trembling, and other kinds of biologically based fear reactions that we have that actually release and discharge fear, raging, and I'm talking about just healthy raging. I'm not talking about being a bully towards other people. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about healthy raging away from other people, maybe with a support person, but not towards the person you're raging at. And interestingly enough, yawning. And people will cycle through these, like someone who's laughing really hard 10 minutes from now may suddenly burst into tears. I think I talk in Joyous Recovery about how common it is in a group of friends who are having one of those really fun kind of laughing fits where for 15 minutes everybody's laughing and nobody can stop. Suddenly someone breaks into tears. Mm-hmm. And that's such a common outcome in one of those group laughing fits. And then everyone starts to feel bad, and it's like, there's nothing to feel bad about. It's just that our healing processes are interwoven. They're meant to interweave. And so there's reasons why laughter leads to crying and why crying leads to laughter, because crying will also lead to laughter. It's not just that laughter leads to crying. People end up crying a lot at funerals and then feeling guilty about the fact, oh God, we shouldn't be crying at a funeral. That's so inappropriate. Actually, it's totally natural. Why? Because laughter tends to lead to crying, crying tends to lead to laughter, they all tend to lead to yawning. We don't really get why yawning seems like it doesn't fit, right? Like, why is yawning in there? And yet there's some way that it's very clear that yawning is not just releasing physical stress, but it's clearly also releasing emotional stress. It's a very interesting and somewhat mysterious process, but it's really good for you. Actually, I was just talking to someone the other day who specializes in trauma, who was talking about a whole presentation that she had just seen with a trauma specialist working with a very traumatized person through a particularly difficult memory. And she said, the woman was just yawning like crazy. She said it was like, seemed like it was coming right out of your book, because the woman was just yawning like crazy while this therapist took her through this trauma work.
I thought that was so fascinating, and I've done a lot of yoga, right? So it's the same thing within like the lion's breath, I mean, all that kind of yoga stuff, very much healing from our bodies. But Lundy, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Any last minute message you would send out to my ladies?
Well, I would love to just quickly answer a couple of the other questions that I most commonly get.
Sure.
One is, women very often ask me, if he's apologizing, how do I know if he really means it or not, or if it's just like a fakey like apology to get what he wants? And then a related question is, when he promises to change, how do I know if that's a really serious promise? Or again, if he's just like saying what he wants me to hear? And the answer, interestingly, to both of these questions is, it doesn't matter. Women are surprised by this, but the fake apologies and the phony and the real apologies go exactly the same place, nowhere. The fake promises to change and the genuine heartfelt promises to change go exactly the same place, nowhere. So don't worry, don't put any energy. Oops, sorry, hang on a second, I gotta turn off this ringing phone.
Oh, that's okay. So what Lundy's talking about.
So I also say, don't put any energy into figuring out whether his apologies are real or not. They may very well be real. It doesn't matter. The only way he'll change is if he actually starts to do the work of changing, the kinds of things that Sarah was telling you, like here's, you have to look at the actual work. You'll notice like the apologies are not on the list. The promises to change are not on the list of doing the real work, because they just don't matter.
And I say, look at the patterns, not the promises. Promises, what's the pattern of behavior? Is the pattern of behavior changing for an extended amount of time or no? That's how you know.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So then another question I get really often is, how do I know if he's a narcissist or not? And again, I'm actually going to answer again, believe it or not, it doesn't really matter, because there's not a successful therapeutic approach to narcissism. Narcissism does not respond to therapy. It will respond to some extent to a very expensive and intensive twice a week group and individual therapy called dialectical behavior therapy. Good luck getting him to go to that. You'll almost never get him. You almost never get a guy to go to that, an abusive guy to go to that. So if you discover that he does truly have a narcissistic personality disorder, that doesn't help you in any way, because there's not a service for that. All it really tells you is that the situation's even worse than you thought before, because the abusive guy who genuinely does have a narcissistic personality type is even less likely to change. So again, I would say just don't put much energy into that. And then one more is the drugs or alcohol, especially the alcohol is what I hear about the most. Is that really his problem? And the answer again, unfortunately, is no. That's just making him even worse. But it's not the problem. He's got both problems. He's selfish and abusive, and he's got substance abuse.
Well, that's why I say, if I have an article called "Is He a Narcissist or a Jerk? How to Tell and Why It Matters." And it's like, if you're wrestling with a crocodile and you're going, but I need to figure out what breed it is. I need to figure out what breed it is. And you're like bleeding and bloody, and everybody's like, why are you wrestling crocodiles? And you're like, oh, if I could just find out what breed he is, then he'll change. And like, I just want to say, like, all the experts agree that's a bad strategy.
Watch out for those teeth. Just keep your eye on those teeth. That's what matters. If it's a crocodile.
Absolutely. It's about building a beautiful life after crocodiles, and no longer allowing, creating safety cushions and safety nets around yourself, so you're not bitten and bleeding, and your kids are not watching you bit and bleeding.
I think that's perfect. And then I would also add, really starting to look at the kinds of divisions that drive women apart from each other. So you're also focusing on building a life where you're not letting yourself be driven away from other women.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Yeah, in my own life, my life goals: love myself, love my kids, love my tribe, and give the world a better language to navigate abuse. So I have been following in your footsteps, Lundy, and I am so grateful for your work, and thanks for you taking the time out today.
Great talking to you, Sarah. Be well, and good luck to all your audience.
Have a great day.
Everybody be well out there. Take care.